How many dreams can be lost in 2 minutes? As it turns out, more than you might imagine. 109 passengers and crew lost every tomorrow they had planned. A hotel owner's dream was reduced to rubble. The belief that one day the world would routinely travel faster than the speed of sound suddenly felt much further away. Different dreams and different lives, yet every one of them had been entrusted to the same remarkable machine. For more than 2 decades, she had represented the very best of what human ingenuity could achieve. She was admired across the world, envied by other nations, and, for many people, she embodied the future itself. Her name was Concorde. Long before Concorde ever carried a passenger, she began as a dream. In the years after the Second World War, Britain and France set out to build the world's first successful supersonic passenger airliner. Engineers, designers, and governments poured years of work into an aircraft that many believed would change the way the world travelled forever. Concorde was unlike any other passenger aircraft before or since. Flying at a staggering 60,000 feet, she climbed to the edge of the stratosphere, carrying just over 100 passengers across the Atlantic at more than twice the speed of sound, often arriving in New York before they had even left London by local time. But statistics alone could never explain why she inspired such affection. Outside, Concorde announced her arrival long before she came into view. When her 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines roared to life, the noise didn't just fill your ears, it vibrated through your chest. She was a screaming titan of aluminium and steel, tearing the atmosphere apart at Mach 2. People would stop what they were doing and look skywards, waiting for the sleek white aircraft to appear overhead, so they could marvel at its droop nose and delta wings. Concorde was an event that was impossible to ignore. Inside, the transformation was astonishing. Step through the door, and the roaring Titan became a hushed private club. The cabin was small and narrow, yet it never felt cramped. Instead, it created an intimate cocoon of luxury and prestige. Crisp linen clothed the tables, heavy silver cutlery caught the light, and vintage champagne flowed as effortlessly as the conversation. Yet the true romance lay beyond the tiny postcard-sized windows. The sky gradually deepened from blue to an inky black, the curved horizon of the earth stretching silently beneath it. The windows themselves grew warm beneath their fingertips as the aircraft sliced through the air at over 1,300 miles per hour. Even the impossible soon began to feel perfectly natural. For the men and women who worked aboard her, there was nowhere higher to climb. Becoming a Concorde crew member was a dream shared by many and achieved by very few. On the afternoon of Tuesday the 25th of July 2000, that dream belonged to Captain Christian Marty and his crew. For Christian Marty, flying Concorde wasn't simply another posting. Like countless pilots before him, he had devoted years to earning a place in her left-hand seat. Few ever did. To command Concorde was the highest honour in civil aviation, the culmination of years of dedication, discipline and extraordinary skill. On that Tuesday afternoon, Marty was living the dream he had worked his entire career to achieve. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in Paris, and Charles de Gaulle Airport carried on exactly as it did every day. Airliners taxied to and from the runways. Baggage carts weaved between aircraft stands. Fuel trucks, catering vehicles and ground crews worked to tight schedules, each playing their part in keeping one of Europe's busiest airports moving. Among the dozens of departures scheduled that afternoon was Air France Flight 4590. The aircraft assigned to the flight was Foxtrot Bravo Tango Sierra Charlie, a 25-year-old Concorde that had arrived from New York earlier that morning. It was not an ordinary scheduled service. On board were mostly German holidaymakers. They had chartered Concorde through the travel company Peter Dielman and were bound for New York, where the luxury cruise ship Deutschland lay waiting to carry them on a 16-day voyage to Manta in Ecuador. Andreas Schraner, 64, was a retired millionaire from Munich and was treating his wife, daughter, son-in-law and grandchildren to a special 65th birthday celebration. For others, it wasn't simply another summer break, it was a dream. Some had saved for years for this trip of a lifetime. Suitcases had been packed, passports checked, and cameras loaded with fresh film. They had paid for the chance to experience something very few people in the world ever could, a supersonic flight across the Atlantic. At the front of the aircraft, the captain and his crew were preparing for what should have been just another routine crossing of the ocean. During preparations, engineers discovered a fault with one of the aircraft's thrust reversers. Although the defect did not make the aircraft unairworthy, Captain Christian Marty requested that it be repaired before departure, causing a slight delay. At the same time, problems with Air France's check-in system meant that some passengers and their luggage had not been correctly recorded on the flight paperwork. By the time everything was finally resolved, Concorde departed carrying 19 more bags than appeared on the official manifest, leaving the aircraft slightly heavier than it should have been. As passengers settled into their seats, the flight attendants welcomed them aboard and made their final checks through the cabin. Overhead lockers were closed, the doors secured, and the aircraft prepared for departure. Just ahead in the cockpit, Captain Christian Marty, First Officer Jean Marcot, and Flight Engineer Gilles Jardineau worked steadily through Concorde's extensive pre-flight checklist. Together, the three men brought thousands of hours of flying experience to the flight deck. One of the final figures passed to the cockpit was the expected taxi fuel consumption. The dispatcher estimated that Concorde would burn around 2 tons of fuel before takeoff. It was an estimate that would later prove to be significantly higher than the amount actually consumed. And so, that afternoon on the 25th of July 2000, one of the world's most famous passenger aircraft began its takeoff roll at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. For a quarter of a century, Concorde had carried the world's wealthiest and most famous passengers across the Atlantic at twice the speed of sound. But, on this day, Concorde Flight 4590 would remain airborne for little more than 2 minutes. At approximately 2:42 p.m, Flight 4590 was cleared for takeoff. The engines roared into life as reheat was selected, forcing torrents of fuel into the exhaust to generate the immense thrust needed to lift Concorde from the runway. The aircraft surged forward, gathering speed. Unbeknown to the crew, however, Flight 4590 was heavier than they believed. The dispatcher's estimate of taxi fuel consumption had been significantly higher than the amount actually burned, leaving the aircraft carrying around 800 kilograms more weight than the crew's calculations allowed for. There was also another complication. An 8-knot tailwind, though well within operational limits, meant Concorde would accelerate to a higher ground speed before becoming airborne. That placed additional stress on the tyres at precisely the moment they were working the hardest. It was an uncomfortable thought. Throughout Concorde's service, tyre failures had been its Achilles heel. There had already been dozens of tyre bursts, several serious enough to damage the aircraft. Despite improvements over the years, the risk had never disappeared. Inside the cabin, excitement gave way to anticipation as Concorde accelerated down the runway. Beyond the small windows, the concrete rushed past ever faster. But ahead on the tarmac lay something that shouldn't have been there. Barely 5 minutes earlier, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had departed from the very same runway. During its takeoff roll, a narrow strip of titanium alloy had broken away from one of the aircraft's engine nacelles. Around 43 centimetres long, the metal wear strip tumbled onto the runway behind it. The DC-10 climbed away towards its destination, its crew completely unaware that anything had been lost. The strip of titanium remained where it had fallen. With runways at Charles de Gaulle inspected only twice each day, there was nothing to alert anyone to the danger now lying on the tarmac, and Concorde was accelerating straight towards it. Inside the cockpit, the crew continued to manage the takeoff. Concorde surged forward, gathering speed with astonishing acceleration until it passed V1 at 150 knots. From that moment, there was no longer enough runway remaining to stop safely. Whatever happened next, the aircraft was committed to flight. As the plane thundered down the runway, the left main landing gear passed over the strip of titanium lying on the ground. The number 2 tyre struck it and burst with explosive force, scattering fragments of rubber in every direction. One of the largest pieces, weighing almost 10 pounds, was hurled upwards into the underside of the left wing, directly beneath fuel tank number 5. It never pierced the tank itself, but it didn't have to. The sheer force of the impact sent a violent pressure wave through the fuel inside, rupturing the tank from within. Investigators would later recover part of the tank wall from the runway, confirming exactly how the failure had occurred. Fuel immediately began pouring from the ruptured tank. Moments later it ignited, most likely after debris from the exploding tyre damaged electrical wiring inside the undercarriage bay, creating an electrical arc. A huge sheet of flame erupted beneath the left wing, instantly visible from the control tower. Air traffic controller Gilles Logelin saw the fire at once and radioed the cockpit without hesitation. Only then did the crew realise the scale of the emergency unfolding around them. A major fire was burning beneath the aircraft, yet Concorde had already passed the point where a rejected takeoff was possible. There simply wasn't enough runway left to stop. The decision had effectively been made for them. They had no choice but to fly. As the end of the runway rushed towards them, Captain Christian Marty eased back on the control column. Concorde rotated, lifted clear of the ground, and climbed into the Paris sky, trailing a vast plume of smoke and flame. For a brief moment, Concorde was airborne, but almost immediately it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The fire beneath the left wing was now affecting the engines. Numbers 1 and 2 began surging and rapidly losing power, most likely after ingesting the intense heat and gases from the fire below, while engine 1 is also thought to have swallowed fragments of the shattered tyre. Quite literally, the engines were beginning to choke. Then came another blow. A fire warning illuminated in the cockpit, and the flight engineer shut down engine number 2 as the crew began carrying out the emergency procedures they had practiced countless times before. Captain Christian Marty ordered the landing gear to be retracted, but it refused to move. "The gear isn't retracting," the first officer reported. The words carried enormous significance. Concorde needed to accelerate and climb away from the ground, but with the landing gear still extended, it was hitting an enormous wall of air resistance in front of it. At the very moment the aircraft most needed performance, it was being robbed of it. The situation was becoming impossible. The aircraft was burning, it was losing thrust, and it was struggling to climb. Even its speed was falling short. Concorde was travelling at around 200 knots, when, with an engine failure, it should have been closer to 220. Inside the cockpit, the crew searched desperately for a way out. Returning to Charles de Gaulle no longer seemed possible. Instead, their thoughts turned to the nearby airport at Le Bourget. As more fire warnings sounded, another voice broke through the cockpit. "Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!" The ground proximity warning system was telling them what they already knew. They were running out of height. Although they had been cleared to return to Charles de Gaulle, the first officer's reply made it clear their plan had changed. "Le Bourget, negative, we're trying Le Bourget." Moments later, he added just 2 more words. Airspeed, airspeed. A few seconds later, the flight data recorder showed Concorde suddenly rolling violently to the left, reaching a bank angle of around 113 degrees, most likely after fire damage affected the aircraft's flight controls. Seconds later, the cockpit voice recorder fell silent. At approximately 2:44 that afternoon, Air France Flight 4590 crashed into the Hotelissimo hotel in Gonesse, just beyond the airport boundary. The aircraft was destroyed. All 109 passengers and crew on board lost their lives, including Andreas Schraner and all of his family. Inside the hotel, 4 employees were also killed. For them, it had begun as just another afternoon at work. The owner of the hotel, Michelle Frischteau, survived but suffered serious burns. She had poured years of hope, ambition and investment into building her dream hotel. In an instant, that dream came to a violent end. Across France and then across the world, the news spread fast. The impossible had happened. Concorde had carried millions of passengers at twice the speed of sound over a quarter of a century. It had become one of the safest and most admired airliners ever built. Yet now, for the first time in its history, a Concorde had crashed. Investigators faced an extraordinary question. How could this have happened? In the hours that followed, the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, better known as the BEA, began the painstaking task of reconstructing Concorde's final flight. Every piece of wreckage was examined, every recording analysed, and every metre of runway searched for clues. It wasn't long before investigators found one of the most important. Lying on the runway was the strip of titanium that Concorde had struck during its takeoff roll. They would eventually trace it to the Continental Airlines DC-10 that had departed just minutes before Flight 4590. And as more evidence was gathered, the sequence of events became unmistakably clear. The metal strip had caused the tyre to explode, which then resulted in the devastating fire. Concorde simply could not accelerate or climb away safely. The chain of events had lasted only a matter of seconds. But the investigation also revealed that the disaster was about far more than a single strip of titanium. It exposed a series of vulnerabilities that had existed within Concorde for years. Tyre failures were not unknown. During the aircraft's service, tyres had burst dozens of times as they endured the enormous loads and speeds of takeoff. Usually the damage was limited, but Flight 4590 had revealed a far more dangerous weakness. Investigators also examined whether Concorde's weight had contributed to the disaster. Although the aircraft had departed above its certified takeoff weight, the BEA concluded that the effect on its takeoff performance was negligible and that it was not a significant factor in the accident. Other possibilities were examined as well. Investigators discovered that a spacer was missing from the left undercarriage bogie, the result of an Air France maintenance error. Although the BEA concluded that the flight data ruled it out as a contributing factor, some former Concorde pilots remained unconvinced. They believed the missing spacer may have allowed the undercarriage to vibrate during the takeoff roll, delaying liftoff just enough for Concorde to reach the section of runway where the titanium strip lay. Attention also turned to the DC-10 itself. Maintenance records showed that the titanium wear strip had been replaced twice in the previous 2 months. The replacement strip was the wrong size and had been drilled with 37 holes instead of the 12 permitted by the manufacturer. Investigators concluded that repeated movement of the engine's thrust reverser eventually caused the strip to fracture and fall onto the runway. Finally, the BEA examined the actions of Captain Christian Marty and his crew. Their conclusion was clear. The crew had reacted professionally and followed their emergency procedures, but they had been confronted with a combination of failures for which no simulator training had ever prepared them. By the time the fire took hold, the engines began losing thrust and the landing gear failed to retract, there was little, if anything, they could have done to save the aircraft. The legal aftermath continued for years. In 2010, a French court found Continental Airlines and one of its mechanics criminally responsible. The airline was fined and ordered to pay damages. But 2 years later, an appeals court overturned the criminal convictions, ruling that although the metal strip had triggered the accident, the circumstances did not justify criminal responsibility. Civil liability, however, remained. Compensation was paid to Air France and to many of the victims' families through a series of civil settlements, bringing some financial closure, though nothing could ever undo the loss suffered by all those left behind. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, both Air France and British Airways grounded their Concorde fleets, while engineers worked to address the vulnerabilities the accident had exposed. Stronger, burst-resistant tyres were developed, Kevlar liners were fitted inside the fuel tanks, and a number of other safety improvements were introduced. Concorde eventually returned to commercial service in November 2001. But the world had changed. Just weeks earlier, the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September had brought international air travel to a standstill, and the already small market for supersonic passenger travel declined even further. Faced with falling passenger numbers, rising maintenance costs, and an ageing fleet, Air France and British Airways announced Concorde's retirement in 2003. The terrible tragedy that warm summer afternoon had unfolded in little more than 2 minutes. In that brief space of time, the passengers lost the futures they believed were waiting for them in America. Families lost parents, children, and grandparents. A hotel owner watched years of work disappear in fire and wreckage. And for the crew, the aircraft they had dedicated their careers to became the place where those careers and their lives came to an end. And something else was lost that afternoon. For more than a quarter of a century, Concorde had made the impossible appear almost ordinary. It had carried people across the Atlantic faster than the earth could turn beneath them, and had offered a glimpse of a future where distance itself might one day become almost irrelevant. Concorde did briefly fly again, but the certainty surrounding it never fully returned. The aircraft that had once seemed to represent the future had shown that it too was vulnerable. How many dreams can be lost in 2 minutes? On the afternoon of the 25th of July 2000, the answer was far more than anyone could ever imagine. Now, at one time during my Royal Air Force career, I was stationed near Heathrow Airport, and I saw Concorde fly over many, many times. You always knew Concorde was coming, because the window frames started to vibrate long before you ever saw her. Our condolences go out to the families of all those who lost their lives in this terrible incident, and to everyone else who was affected by it. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.